that wraps that segment. But can you do one or two more segments with us? You got a
Sure.
few. You got a little more time. All right,
Yep.
because I want to do particularly. I want to do clip number 2. This piece from Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, of course, who people don't know this, but Daniel Bessner and I deeply admire Tony Blair.
You're a big Tony Blair.
Yeah, we're big Tony Blair fans. We're just trying to live the Tony Blair life. But no, this guy is. I actually, again, I mean, he's to me, he is a fascinating figure, and obviously, a grotesque figure and sinister and so on. But I mean, actually, maybe you can weave in why he is a fascinating figure. I mean, he is actually this kind of ongoing living reality of the 90s in so many ways. But this clip on him basically saying, trying to push forward, and this is something that even in his own government, there was national ID that he was pushing forward aggressively when he was prime minister. The UK, I believe, actually has more surveillance cameras per capita than any other place on the planet.
They got started early in the 90s, I believe, very early.
Right. And accelerated, I think, or maybe even just started in the late 90s under New Labour. But the next phase, I mean, one of the things that's so disturbing about Corona is that we're on one hand, in the United States, we're, sitting in the reality that we have an administration that's going to let, tens of thousands of people die, a complete decimation of public health infrastructure and everything else. Then there's this conversation, though, that's also going to be about basically like the next wave of biopolitics. And I wanted to play this clip of Tony Blair talking about digital IDs and Corona, and then get your thoughts on it, because I think this really can't be situated in a kind of a Chila Bimbe, a Gambin conversation. And more prosaically, there's huge money to be made here. This is Tony Blair talking about digital ID.
Create a digital ID today that is much more easily protected, so you can deal with a lot of the privacy and surveillance issues that worry people. But it's a natural evolution of the way that we're going to use technology in any event to transact daily life. And this COVID crisis gives an additional reason for doing that. Because, look, I could be wrong about this, but when I look at, for example, how you restart some businesses, how you restart international travel, I think people's disease status, for example, have they been tested? What is the result of that test? Have they had the disease? Do they have the disease? I think unless you're able to record some of this data in a way that people can use, it's going to be difficult to go back to anything like a near normal in things like transport. So if you're going to start international travel again, how do you do that unless people can be easily tested and have some record of that test?
Danny, thoughts?
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, when you were talking about Blair, that I always consider him and Clinton to really be a duo, and that Clinton represents sort of the meritocratic, charming side of neoliberalism, and Blair is really like the technocrat. And so that little soliloquy was so interesting. He gets like turned on when he starts talking about his like eyes light up, talking about like managing people and tracking people, and he's just the apotheosis, the apex of a certain form of liberal technocracy that took off in the early 20th century, and with the dreams of Frederick Winslow Taylor to essentially directly manage the minutia of everyone's lives. And I think Blair, what excites him is the fact that he's the ultimate 20th century manager, and that he truly believes in things like technology and social science to discreetly track human behavior. And it was just that whole discussion just evinced that to a T, that he's so happy that the individual will be able to finally track and monitor everyone. It's funny that you mentioned Achille Mbembe and everyone, because this really brings us back to Foucault, right? And the sort of Foucauldian dream, or Foucault argues that one of the defining features of modernity is the idea that everyone could at once be totally tracked and not know if they're being tracked and therefore be totally tracked. And this is exactly the realization of that dream through technology. So I think it's very interesting to examine it. It's a real element of modern liberalism, a really important one.
Yeah, and an enormous, I mean, this is the next area too, like of primitive accumulation, basically, of a basic accumulation. You can, you know, there's the artificial scarcity of basically creating markets, just fake markets through technology. Like a technology could be unlocked, could be open source, but instead we'll do the most regimented IP programs on it and turn it into something that you can essentially rent, you know, the kind of like the feudal Silicon Valley model. And then there is the last remnants in the ecological crisis of basically bioprospecting places like the Amazon for pharma and things like that. And then there is the interior. I mean, the like internal bio of the body. And I want people to actually, especially also though, because if you don't have this either innate deep concern about civil liberties from both public and private institutions, which you should, or you don't have the kind of intellectual infrastructure, it sounds totally commonsensical. Like, of course we need to track and see, like we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And because I know that that's also going to come across in that as well.
So do you know the phrase knowledge is power? That doesn't actually mean, people misuse it, they say it means like education means like you'll get powerful in society, but it actually referred to the idea that literally taxonomizing and designating something that is knowledge of something gives one power over it. And so I think it's important to think of this as part of that process by literally identifying something as a problem. For example, not having a particular thing in you, you're essentially disciplining it. And I think that's exactly right. And what's the disciplinary nature of this is I think you're right, primitive accumulation, related to sort of Marxist processes of capital accumulation by essentially identifying things to be bought and sold. Right, because things can't be bought or sold or work on a market unless they're identified. So I think this is where you could see how Foucauldian and Marxian insights come together very nicely, in that they to get a little academic about it, they very much complement each other in understanding how the present society governs itself, and it works in everything, and then I'll stop. But it works in everything. For example, like ankle monitors, right? You have to buy the ankle monitor which people violate, which then gives more capital to the state, which then impoverishes a certain class in the cycle. So I just think this is a general tendency that is important to take cognizance of.
I think that like we are really in a very important political moment too when it comes to privacy and those individual rights. And it's so frustrating because of the way that it's played out specifically in the United States, where like wearing a mask has become such like a cultural signifier, right? It's like the people who believe in science versus like the loony right wingers. But you know, I think like Amberly Frost's essay in Damage magazine a couple weeks ago on wearing the mask and, you know, sort of resisting the idea of it, saying like, yes, I wear the mask because I understand the role that it plays, but resisting this other kind of like liberal like embrace, right, of like accepting all of these restrictions and tattling on your neighbors. Like there's a very frightening aspect to all of this, and it's like we should understand this as like a sacrifice that we're doing collectively, and not like an embrace or like some kind of symbol of basically being people who are prepared to accept and obey whatever is given to them by the state and by authorities. And you see, like, the worst aspect of this would be this kind of Tony Blair fantasy of basically being able to track everybody across the world. I mean, he's talking.
Unfortunately, it's not much of a fantasy.
No, I mean, but he's talking about too, like a supranational level kind of as well.
Well, this would be privately done.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I would be shocked if Tony Blair doesn't, you know, sit on a board or isn't involved. You know, I mean, you know, he's got extensive post prime ministerial portfolio of this stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The struggle that we've seen with the movement for Black Lives and these protests over the past couple of weeks is something that's very important, that people are actually saying, we understand that going out into public does come with the risk of potentially like spreading the virus, but we are actually making a political choice right now that standing up for these rights supersedes that. And I think that's actually is like something that's been very encouraging on a political level, that people are willing to make those distinctions, because there was a real moment when this first started that I was feeling a lot of pessimism of like, you know, this creating a scenario that is perfect for like hyper like technocratic neoliberalism to take control. Everyone's staying in your place. You're consuming primarily virtually. The public is completely dissipated, and you get maybe food delivered a couple times a week, all while like this massive underclass is like exposing themselves to the virus, like in the shadows. There is a real development of a very frightening future that still is ongoing. But
yeah, I mean, that's still, and I love what you're saying, David. And I just want to add another quick point to this for you guys to riff off of, because I think this is another one of these conversations where it's like, there really is, I don't know what terminology you want to use, but I do think if you have the worldview that we have, you know, whatever, anti-essentialist, Marxist oriented, whatever, it really reveals just the lunacy of so many of these debates, like the mask, right? Like the right-wing thing is, you know, it's a conspiracy theory, dad, you know, don't tell me what to do, fuck, or it's just pure horrific narcissism. And then on the other hand, you know, the liberal answer is like, not, well, of course we're going to do this right now, but as you say, we're going to deeply question and resist the overall tendency. We're not going to just say like, oh, well, sure, Tony Blair wants us to have, you know, digital ID now, you know, and then, you know, and I think Benjamin Studebaker had a really smart piece about this too, that like even the mask thing, like, again, and it's annoying how much we have to say it, but, you know, like in Amber's piece, it was a great piece, and she said wear the mask, but, you know, the fact that government isn't providing the masks, let alone hospital beds and everything else, is the structural problem here. And that like culture war skirmish is not where the ultimate action is. The ultimate action is in the lack of health infrastructure. And I think like even, and the last point really quick, like there were people that, you know, all of a sudden like medical and other authorities came out and said, well, actually all of a sudden it's totally fine to break quarantine because this is a serious issue. And like the truth of the matter is actually more deep and more challenging than what you're saying, Griscom, which is like, of course it's not safe that we've been out protesting. Yeah. And of course, by the pandemic logic, you shouldn't be breaking the lockdown. But in fact, police murder and terrorism of Black and brown and poor and working communities is superseding that. Mm-hmm. And people have made that democratic choice. And that is infinitely more important and correct. It is the right choice, in my opinion, and not something that can actually be reverse engineered to be justified in a technocratic way, because it isn't technocratic. It's a democratic uprising, even in the context of the objective reality and risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a political choice, essentially, right. Is what you're saying.
Right.
And oftentimes different value fields come in conflict: politics, technocracy, health, even. And it has to, one has to make a choice. And what really frustrated me, I don't know if you saw this, guys, but there was a lot of discussion in right-wing media. It's like, how could all these public health officials support the protests and not support, you know, people going to ransacking Walmart for consumption purposes, right? And it just highlighted to me the total poverty of American political discourse, where everyone's talking about categories, right? The category of leaving and massing and taking no cognizance of the different political values. And I think that's important, because I think it relates to that nonsense over James Bennett, is that what we're seeing now is a transformation in how people understand the news, where the idea that there was a view from nowhere is coming under increasing question. I think largely because the post-World War II consensus in terms of politics, geopolitics, economics is itself coming under question. We're seeing a big transformation in how people understand the basic profession of providing information to what we call the public. And that's also a really interesting question that I think relates to a lot of these larger processes that you, David, and Michael just identified.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.